So I got home from my 14-hour flight back from Brazil, and this was waiting for me. This is the Nirvana controller. Finally, we've been waiting for this controller for quite some time, and as you can tell from this cover, you probably recognize it from the Turnigy Evolution controller, and this is supposed to be a follow-up to the Turnigy Evolution. It has been in development for 2 years, or more than 2 years, and the original people that developed the Evolution controller are the ones that developed this controller. Those original people have now broken off and become Underground FPV, and if you look on the back of the controller, you do see the Underground FPV emblem because it is their design. Frsky is just the manufacturer, and they were forced to put that on the controller, unfortunately. So, before I get started, first of all, this is just an overview, just kind of first impressions of this controller, and I'm going to talk about the fit and feel of the controller overall, how it feels in the hands, because, as you can probably tell, it has a pretty radical design, and it looks like, I think it was codenamed the Dark Knight because it looks like a Batman symbol, sort of. Anyways, there's one thing I have to say about this controller right off the bat. When you first pick it up and you hold it in your hands, you cannot help but think, holy moly, this thing is the most solid feeling controller I have ever felt in the history of this sport, in the history of any RC toy product I've ever held. This controller feels like it is carved out of a solid block of titanium or granite. It just feels so darn solid in your hands. All the fit and finish of everything, all the tolerances are super duper tight. Everything feels super ultra high quality. The plastic is super dense. It feels incredible, and I cannot overstate that. Doesn't matter how much I say it, the first time you pick up this controller, you will think to yourself, you'll think, wow, that's a solid controller. Okay, let's move past that. The other thing that people will first say is, well, it's made by Frsky. So Frsky is a company that makes a lot of stuff. They make good stuff, they make bad stuff, they make OEM stuff, they make Frsky stuff. You don't know what is Frsky and what isn't Frsky. Taranis, for all we know, is made by Frsky. They could just outsource it to Frsky to make the casing, make the controller, and then they just sell it under the Frsky name. We don't really know because it's China. So Frsky is just the manufacturer. Now, it does use the Frsky protocol, which again is another thing that people will say, I don't like the Frsky protocol. I don't want to switch over all my 12, 20, whatever quads to Frsky, which I agree with. And I personally didn't like Frsky protocol in the past, but it has improved quite a bit, and iBus is actually faster than S-Bus, and it has all the same perks. It has telemetry, it tells you when your range is low, it does all that stuff for you. This controller is running OpenTX, so it does have kind of the best of all worlds. Now, that being said, the controller does come with 2 receivers. It comes with this standard receiver, which is a diversity receiver. It's got the 2 diversity plugs, and it comes with this little baby receiver, which is their micro receiver. Now, you'll immediately say, well, I don't really like either one of these receivers, and I would agree with you because this one is just too big. Although it will fit in most of my quads, it's just too big. And this one, it doesn't have the ability to put a longer antenna on it, and it doesn't come with the diversity antennas like the RXSR of Frsky does. So I really hope that they improve this receiver and this smaller version and give us that ability. I do like the fact that it doesn't have the connector on it like the RXSR, which means it'll fit into my tight builds much easier. So the receiver issue is really, I wouldn't say a non-issue, but it's not really a big deal. It will get better in the future, but for now, it's not really a huge deal. And the Frsky protocol is actually fine. And I haven't had any issues. I have used it already, and I haven't had issues with it at all. It should be fine. And another thing you can take a look real quick is that the antenna over here, it flips out, so you're not going to break the antenna. And if you put Crossfire on there, which I think most people do, or not most people, a lot of people that have been doing this a while already use Crossfire, so it's not really a big deal for them. You just pop in your Crossfire and you're good to go. And that's where I'm going to stop on the controller right now, and I'm going to look at the history of other controllers because I'm going to compare and contrast what the controllers are like. So let's start off with the original, or not the original, the one that most people started with, the Taranis X9D. Now, this is not the original controller, obviously. It is a controller that I think the majority of people in this community have at least started with or had in the past. It's a controller that Frsky has bought this mold of the controller from another company. I don't even remember the name. And it's the look, the mold of the controller is like, I don't even know how old. It's extremely old. That's why it looks like it's from like the 50s, because it kind of is from the 50s. I don't know when it was designed, but it looks hideous. It's a massive, clunky thing. It's annoying. The switches are massive. There's really no need for a lot of this stuff on here anymore, for at least us mini quad pilots. Not for plane pilots. This is a really good all-around controller, and the reason why it has probably stood the test of time is because it's an incredibly good value for all the things that it does and all the functions that it has. For me, it has been, this controller that you're looking at right now is 5 years old. It is actually 5 years old. It has been my primary controller for 5 years. I've used it probably on average every third day for at least a couple of packs for 5 years, and it still works perfectly. These are the original gimbals. I have not changed anything about the controller. Yes, my gimbals don't center perfectly anymore. They get a little bit of drift here and there, but I don't see it when I'm actually flying, so it's kind of a non-issue for me. I've tried the M9 gimbals, but I don't really care too much to upgrade because I don't feel that big of a benefit. I don't really feel any benefit with the M9 gimbals. I mean, the gimbals feel totally smooth and perfectly fine to me. I'm also not really crazy about this quad ball bearing. I mean, there's a lot of marketing going on with controllers and gimbals. I'm gonna talk more about the actual controller feel and how you actually use it. And one of the things I would say about this controller is that even though it's really huge and clunky, it does have a couple things going for it that people may not fully realize. The gimbals are really long. I wouldn't even call them standard anymore. They're like long travel gimbals, because most other controllers that I've used are shorter travel gimbals, and I really prefer this long travel. I really like this long travel. Another thing it has is that it has this balance bar here where you put your neck strap on, and it doesn't matter how much crap you strap to it, your crossbar, your battery, or whatever you have on here, you can balance it pretty nicely, and no matter what, you can just kind of pull it tight against your neck, and you can keep it kind of centered, and it's useful. I mean, it's not great for thumbers. If you have big hands like I do, it kind of feels fine in the hand for thumbers. If you're a pincher, I mean, I've been using it for 5 years. I've been pinching for more than 4 of those 5 years. I still don't have a good place to put my fingers. Every time I pick the damn thing up, I have a new place to put my fingers for pinching. But that being said, it does work really well. The Gimbal Travel is 46 millimeters. I have measured that at 46 millimeters, and the controller thickness is really thick. But after having used so many controllers, I look at something other than just the thickness, although that is a massive factor to how ergonomic it is, at least in my hands. I look at kind of the arc of the travel of the gimbal, and I look at where the center point of that arc is. And if you look at this arc, the center point of this arc is actually like down here. It's really low inside the controller. So in reality, when you are using the controller, it doesn't feel like the controller is as thick and fat as it is. And that's a very important point, which I'll discuss in the next controllers I'll talk about. But for the most part, this has been a pretty awesome controller, even though it's not that awesome, but it's been a pretty awesome controller. And I think everybody can find a number of problems they have with it, but it has worked over the years. Now, Taranis then came out with this one, which is the QX7. And I personally think that this is a better overall controller, but also worse in many ways. I think it's better overall because the gimbals, not only are they using the same kind of construction gimbal, even though it's like a different mounting platform, they're using the same construction gimbal, so you get that same very low position in the controller of its pivot point. It's also a little bit inset. As you can see, kind of it's set below the rim of the controller, whereas this one is kind of set, even though it looks like it's inset, it's kind of got a bulk on it. It just feels like this gimbal is a little bit higher than this gimbal. So even with these fat grips and this big rubber down here, which I think is kind of pointless, it feels better to me for pinching than the original X9D. And I think that's primarily because of these flat points up here. This flatness on the top here, this angle, gives me somewhere to rest my fingers. And there's also no switches in the way here, so it's a really nice, easy way for me to grip the controller. Of course, there's a number of issues with this controller still. It doesn't work well with Crossfire. Even though I've done the Crossfire mod, it still doesn't work 100%. The firmware or the version of OpenTX is nerfed on here, so it doesn't really give you all the things. I mean, it does give you all the things, but it's really hard to access them because the screen is lower resolution. This particular one that I have has never properly given me telemetry, like when I go past my range, if I go get under 40% RSI, it doesn't actually alarm me. It only tells me when I've lost reception, which is kind of pointless, which is why I've gone back to using the original X9D. I don't only use Crossfire, although that is my primary function. I do make a lot of dumb little quads with Frsky, with like little baby quads and other random things. I just use the random Frsky receivers that I have lying around. And I do like to have that telemetry function, so I've gone back to the X9D because it works better with Crossfire and it works better kind of with everything all around. But I do prefer this controller, and there's a couple things that Frsky did on this controller which I really appreciate and I really love. First of all, they made the switches really easy to clip off and make them short so they don't break in my bag, and that's really nice. I hate the antenna, it's really stupid and huge. They made it really easy to work on. So if you take this battery plate off, which I've done like a battery mod in there, there's only 4 screws and the whole back plate comes off. There's no wires attached to the back, there's nothing on the back. So it makes it really, really easy to access all the insides and work on. That is something that no other controller I know of has at all. So I really like this controller, and I still recommend it to this day. I think it's a really great value, although because of the lack of telemetry, I don't know, mine might be broken. I'm not really a fan of it. So then there were a couple of other controllers, and also the Turnigy Evolution, which I won't talk about, but I'll kind of talk about at the end. I wasn't a fan of the FlySky protocol back then, so I didn't even bother with the Turnigy Evolution because it wasn't OpenTX and it didn't give me telemetry. It basically didn't do what I wanted to do, so I didn't even bother with that. But this is another controller company which I have kind of looked at. The jumper controllers, there's a couple of them now, and I was really looking forward to this controller because it's a multi-protocol whatever, and it was supposed to work with Crossfire, which it does work, but not really that well. You kind of have to hack it to get it to work. And I was really interested in it because it's a small, cheap controller, and I really wanted a smaller controller. Unfortunately, when I took it out of the box and I felt it in my hands, I kind of grabbed it and I started moving around. I'm like, oh, this is like a toy. This is really tiny. And then I realized that the reason why it feels so small is not only because it's physically narrow, it's because the controller actually tapers at the bottom. So when you grip it with your hands, you get this really bad angle on your wrist that makes it really unergonomic. Additionally, the gimbals are short throw, so they have about 40 millimeters of range on them, which is 6 millimeters less than the original Taranis, and the springs are so light. It's like they might as well not even have springs on these gimbals. And I personally prefer the strongest spring tension possible because the way I fly is not necessarily pinching and holding it to like in the mid position. I kind of just push against the stick and I expect the stick tension to push back against me. That's how I fly when I'm standing, that's how I fly when I'm walking around, and I can still be smooth because I don't have to worry about, oh, my fingers kind of jostling around. I can just put tension on the stick and hold it there and it'll work well. Other issues with this controller is the antenna, which is stupid, but I think it actually unscrews. Yeah, it does unscrew. Overall, it's just not a very ergonomic controller for me. If it had that A frame a little bit wider and I didn't have such a weird wrist angle on it, it does feel really good for pinching, and it does have a really, really, really thin body, almost as thin as the Nirvana controller, which is pretty darn amazing. And if you look at the travel of the gimbal, or the arc that the gimbal makes when it turns, it's kind of high up. It's kind of right there, which is not unlike the other Taranis controllers, the QX7 and X9D. Even though it feels really thin, it still feels like it has really long sticks. So it feels kind of unwieldy because it's just so long. Then came the X-Lite, which is this. First time I picked this controller up, I was like, whoa, this feels incredible. When you hold this thing, you're just like, oh, this feels like exactly what I want. This is it. This is mine. Unfortunately, then you start moving the sticks around, and you're like, oh man, these gimbals are so small. Why are they so small? This could be so good. And that is what I'm constantly yelling at myself. There's a couple of really big annoyances with this controller. One of them being, or the main one being, these tiny little gimbals. And additionally, when you look at the arc of the gimbal, I have actually extended these sticks as far as I can. Later on, I realized that there's a grub screw inside here that you can twist down and you can extend the gimbal. Additionally, they also did that cool thing like on the QX7 where you can access the insides, but they gave you access from the inside. From the outside to the inside, you can actually adjust your gimbals with these 2 peg screws from the outside, which is really nice. They also made this new kind of JR, or just this new plug on it, which I don't appreciate. I really wish I could just use Crossfire easily without doing any mods on it, but you can't. But the Frsky protocol is nice, and they cut the antenna off and gave you the ability to screw on an antenna, which is also very nice. Very, very nice. It's using very annoying 18500 batteries, which are super duper annoying, but hey, they work, and you don't really have to charge them all the time, but when you do want to charge them, you have to take the damn things out of the controller, whatever. The firmware is the same nerfed firmware as the QX7, but it does work. It actually does give you low signal warnings, which is really nice. The only really big deal breaker for me is the gimbal travel because it's so short, and like I showed you, the arc of this gimbal is pretty high up in the controller. Coupled with the girth of the controller, it's actually pretty thick, which makes it very comfortable for thumbing. But when you increase the gimbal height of this controller, you still only get 38 millimeters of stick travel, which is a full 7 millimeters less than the original Taranis, which is kind of a significant number now. It's a pretty big number. 7 millimeters of travel, it's almost a centimeter of travel. And because the arc, the actual center of arc, is actually very high in the controller, if you lengthen these gimbals out, it feels really unwieldy because the sticks feel so long. And I would say that this controller is shockingly really good for pinching as well. Because it has these flat spots on top, it makes it really, really comfortable to pinch. You can put your fingers on top. It's got these little tiny switches that are really, really convenient. It's still got these knobs, so it's okay for plane pilots. I don't know how the trims work. I haven't figured that out yet, but I'm sure it has some sort of trim in there. And it's really comfortable to hold like this in this grip position. Actually, I prefer this grip to pretty much everything else, and the nice tiny size of the controller. I just wish the gimbals weren't so tiny and so crappy, and I wish I could put my crossfire in there. So of course, thank you Frsky for making something that's almost there but not quite there. Of course, the biggest issue aside from the gimbals is the fact that you have to take the freaking batteries out of the controller to charge. Anyways, all right, let's now take a look at a controller which people have pretty much forgotten at this point. It's not even kind of in anybody's radar anymore, which is the Phantom controller. So a while ago, I recognized that, man, why does my Phantom controller just feel so good in my hands compared to my Taranis controller? And I looked at it very closely. There's a number of things that make this controller just feel so good for thumbing and for pinching. So, I mean, kudos to DJI. They have realized something. This general shape of the controller is kind of, to me, it's just really comfortable. It's just really comfortable to hold, both for thumbing and pinching. And it's not something that should be overlooked. People that are making controllers should really consider taking a close look at this controller. For one thing, the gimbals are on an arc, so it's kind of easier to access the full travel of the gimbal with thumbs or pinching. The center of travel of the gimbal is actually pretty high up in the controller, which isn't fantastic, but you have such a nice stable grip of the controller that it's really easy to reach the gimbals. It's just like, it's a controller that feels equally as good for thumbing and for pinching, and that's more, I can say, than any of the other controllers I've shown you so far. The X-Lite is really the closest controller to being as good for thumbing and pinching. So let's move on to finally the Nirvana. Now this is a very, very, very special controller. Like I said, people that made this, it's really a passion project for them, and it's an incredible good quality controller. Just the best quality feel I've felt. Yes, more than the Spectrum controllers, I'll say that right out. I personally think that the Spectrum controllers don't feel great to me. I just am not a Spectrum guy. And the Spectrum controller with the screen on it, the very pricey Spectrum controller with the screen and the Android and the capacitive touchscreen, I just don't even understand that product. But this controller has a capacitive touchscreen. It's not slow. The firmware, actually, at least the tester firmware that I have, works pretty briskly. It does all the functions that OpenTX does. Everything is much easier to access because it's a nice touchscreen and everything flows. It's very much like a cell phone. It's nothing new other than it being on a controller that we're not used to. So what about this controller and its grip and its finish? So I would say that, to me, thumbing on this controller feels almost as good as the X-Lite. Not quite as good, but every single other thing on this controller is better than the X-Lite. So I wouldn't even consider recommending the X-Lite anymore if somebody's willing to spend, I don't know, $50 more for this controller, which I think is well worth it for this kind of quality. But let's look at all the other features. So the side is probably the most unique thing about this controller, and I don't know where they got this idea but it's really cool. So this little grip thing in here, I'm assuming this is intended for stability. When you put your hands on the controller, you kind of want to just kind of grip your fingers on the side and really hold it. So it makes it really interesting that you can get that stability. This is kind of like, you know those cell phone grippers that people put on the back of their phone that you kind of slip your fingers into and you can hold your phone really easily, and it's really easy to like use your phone and you don't fall on your phone doesn't fall on your face when you're sleeping in bed and trying to look at your phone over your face. Anyways, I think that's what they were trying to go for. And then they put these little switches down here so that it's very easy for you to access them if you're a thumber. If you're a thumber, you got your fingers right there. It's very easy to access these switches, so it makes it super easy to kind of arm and disarm and do all your business over there. They also put these pots on here and these momentary switches and other things so that you can use this for other things too, not just mini quads. It also has trims right on here, which makes it really convenient for planes. This trim knob is actually very, very good quality. It feels really good. Everything feels really incredible quality. And then you have these gimbals, which are from the ground up new gimbals. They are not the gimbals from the Turnigy Evolution. The reason why they're using clear plastic is the same reason why I prefer clear plastic props. It's because the plastic isn't contaminated with the color pigmentation, so the plastic is actually harder, holds up a little bit better, and it just feels different. And they've found that this clear plastic feels better than the colored plastic. It does not light up. There's no lights in it like the Turnigy Evolution, which I'm very thankful for because I'm not really a fan of like super light up stuff. But there are some things that I don't like about the grip of this controller also, and that is that this thing over here is actually in the wrong place for my pinch grip. When I pinch it, this is how I hold it, kind of how you have to hold it for a pinch grip like this. And it's kind of, I have all this empty space here, so it's kind of hard to really get a good grip on it. Additionally, the neck strap is all the way down here, and I don't have the bar to put the neck strap in the middle where I would prefer it to be. So when I hang it on my neck, it's kind of like giving me a fulcrum point that's awkward. So it's really difficult to use so far right now. I have to get that kind of bar right now. Also, this pinch grip, they told me that it is going to be fully customizable. They're going to put out the Thingiverse file so that people can actually print their own grips. And that is probably going to be the number one most amazing thing about this controller, because look how thin this thing is. This thing is so darn thin, and that was really hard for them to do, to get it this thin, because all that gimbal mechanism, it has some girth to it. It's got some thickness. So if I am able to replace this grip here with kind of a slot to put my fingers in so that my two fingers are kind of like resting inside the controller, well, now the controller is fully stable on my hand and I can really get a really intimate feel for the sticks. Now let's talk about these sticks. These gimbals are exceptionally smooth. They are quad ball bearing. They are full digital gimbals. They feel great when you move them around. Unfortunately, the spring tension is super duper loose, and that's because the original designer likes loose spring tension. I've told him that I think that most people like firm spring tension. If for nothing, I like firm spring tension, so please find me some firmer springs, and they are definitely going to have a firmer spring option. But they are also short throw gimbals. They have about 40 to 41 millimeters of travel when you extend the stick. Well, when it's in the short state like this that you see, it has about 39 to 40 millimeters travel. If you extend the sticks all the way, no, actually, short has 40 millimeters travel. If you extend the stick all the way, you can get 46 millimeters travel, which is right in the same ballpark as the Taranis, as the X9 D and the QX7. Unfortunately, the fulcrum point of the stick is actually pretty high up in the controller. It's like over here. So it doesn't feel like it's as thin and small as you would want it to be. That being said, if there is a way to get this spring tension high enough, I don't think I'll have a huge problem with the travel of the stick. This travel problem is really just my issue personally. I don't think it's going to be an issue for most people. You probably won't even notice it. It's not that big of a deal. To me, I think that this controller, when I hold it in my hands, it feels like it's made about 60 to 70% for thumbers and 30 to 40% for pinchers. They try to take into account the way people pinch their controller, way they hold their controllers for pinch grippers, and I think that with the ability to customize this peg over here, which is a really major benefit to me for the ergonomics, I think it can become a very excellent pinch controller, although I really wish that they had full-size gimbals on the controller. All that being said, it works phenomenally well with Crossfire. I mean, working well with Crossfire doesn't really take much effort. It just kind of works. There's nothing good or bad about it. I just can't stop saying enough how good the quality is of the controller. It uses 18650 cell batteries, so it's the standard cell batteries. You can charge the darn thing with a USB port right up here, which is at the top, which makes it really easy to use with your simulators on the computer. They've really thought of a lot of really, really good things, and I'm really appreciative, and it's a very, very special product. This is just an initial overview. I hope it was helpful. I have to work with this controller a little bit more. I really do hope that somebody gives me like a nice TPU kind of thing place to put my fingers so that it can feel better for pinch gripping. But yeah, the features in the firmware that they're going to roll out are impressive, are very impressive. So I would say this is one to watch for in the future. I am going to talk more about this controller in the future after I have kind of tested it fully. So far I've had no issues, and it feels all right. Because the spring tension is so loose, it really is hard for me to use because I am used to much stiffer spring tension. I am going to try and figure out a way to get the spring tension up before they even find the springs to send me to make it firmer. But we'll see what happens as it goes forward. This is just a prototype. This is not the final version. It's not even the final packaging. I haven't even gone over the packaging. The packaging is exceptional as well, although I kind of left that out in the interest of time savings. And that being said, this video is already long enough. Thank you very much for watching, and please keep flossing because it's more important than flying. Thanks.